Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the anatomy of America's biggest military mistakes in history. And to do this, we're going to use a zoom-out metaphor. Imagine a camera lens. We're going to start zoomed all the way in, right down in the mud of the battlefield, where a split-second decision can lead to total disaster. Then, we'll slowly pull that lens back to look at institutional failures, zoom out a bit further to see operational breakdowns, and finally, pull all the way back to examine the massive geopolitical missteps that define grand strategic failures.
To set the stage for this, I want you to hear this quote. "I have always regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made." That's General Ulysses S. Grant, reflecting on a frontal assault back in 1864 that led to as many as 7,000 Union casualties in less than an hour. The human cost of these battlefield mistakes is absolutely staggering. Studying them isn't about pointing fingers, right? It's really about understanding how even the most capable leaders can completely stumble in the fog of war.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're scaling up through 4 distinct levels: the tactical blunders, unprepared for the fight, operational and planning failures, and finally, the grand strategic disconnect.
All right, part 1, the tactical blunders. This is ground zero. We're starting right down in the dirt, where commanders are making real-time decisions under immense pressure, and where one bad call has immediate, devastating consequences. Just looking at the American Civil War shows how repeated tactical errors plagued generals. Take 1862 at Antietam. General McClellan delays his assault, gives the Confederates time to regroup, and turns a potential war-ending victory into a total bloodbath. Fast forward to Chancellorsville in 1863. General Hooker completely freezes up due to miscommunication, allowing Robert E. Lee to break the rules of war, divide his much smaller force, and rout the Union flank. But then Lee himself blunders at Gettysburg with Pickett's charge, just a massive, doomed frontal assault. And as we just talked about, Grant made a very similar tragic calculation at Cold Harbor. It's just a brutal cycle of hesitation, miscommunication, and ill-advised frontal assaults costing tens of thousands of lives.
And we absolutely can't talk about tactical blunders without mentioning Lieutenant Colonel George C. Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Custer's fatal error was just sheer arrogance. He entirely ignored his native scouts, who explicitly told them the encampment up ahead was the largest they had ever seen. By totally underestimating his enemy and misreading the battlefield, he led his men into a decisive, fatal trap against Crazy Horse and Chief Gall.
But tactical errors on the ground? That's really just the tip of the spear. We have to zoom out a bit and ask, what happens when the military institution itself fails to prepare its soldiers before they even lace up their boots?
That brings us to part 2, unprepared for the fight, institutional failures.
This is where bad doctrine, lack of training, and poor resources basically doom a mission before a single shot is fired. A prime example is World War II at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. This was way more than a tactical loss, it was a multi-layered institutional failure. American troops went in with inferior technology compared to the Germans, zero combat experience, and poorly crafted fighting doctrine. And to make it worse, leadership completely misinterpreted vital intelligence from the top-secret Ultra program. It was a massive wake-up call that early war readiness was dangerously inadequate.
Now jump forward to the opening days of the Korean War in 1950, with Task Force Smith. This was a tiny, under-equipped American regimental combat team that got thrown right into the path of a massive invasion. They were swiftly flanked and completely overrun by 20,000 North Korean soldiers.
How does a failure like that happen? It came down to a truly shocking lack of readiness. Get this, they laid their crucial communication wire right on top of the dirt road instead of burying it. Obviously, enemy tanks just rolled right over it and cut their comms. On top of that, they didn't have proper anti-tank weapons, and their peacetime training back in Japan had been completely unrealistic. Ultimately, senior leadership just kind of accepted this institutional unpreparedness, and those brave soldiers on the ground paid the ultimate price.
All right, let's pull that camera lens back even further. How do incredibly complex, high-stakes plans just fall apart before the main event even begins?
Section 3, Operational and Planning Failures. Think back to the 1980 Iran hostage crisis. Operation Eagle Claw is the ultimate example of a highly intricate plan just crumbling under the friction of the real world. The Desert One mission was incredibly complex. 8 helicopters launched into the Great Salt Desert.
But en route, bam, they hit a haboob, a massive blinding sandstorm. Between the brutal weather and mechanical failures, like blown hydraulics and a cracked rotor blade, only 5 helicopters actually arrive in operational condition. Because the strict abort criteria required a minimum of 6 choppers to proceed, field commanders had to advise President Carter to pull the plug, which he did.
But the aftermath is the really crucial part here. During the chaotic evacuation, a horrific collision occurred, killing 8 American servicemen. The official investigation that followed laid bare some severe deficiencies in mission planning, but especially poor inter-service operability. The different military branches literally did not know how to effectively talk to or work with one another. However, this tragedy became a huge catalyst. It forced a fundamental reorganization of the Department of Defense, directly leading to the creation of the U.S. Special Operations Command, JSOC, and the Joint Communications Unit, to make sure an op never fell apart like that again.
Which brings us to one final massive question as we zoom all the way out to the global stage. What happens when your military is so powerful that you win the battles, but you have absolutely no plan for the peace?
Section 4. The Grand Strategic Disconnect.
Now, we're talking entirely about conflicts where the U.S. won the overwhelming majority of its firefights, but fundamentally failed to achieve its geopolitical goals due to flawed macro-level strategy. Let's look at the Tet Offensive in late '67 and early '68. North Vietnamese General Giap orchestrated this massive, synchronized attack on 36 provincial capitals and 5 major cities all at the exact same time.
And this is just a wild historical paradox. Militarily speaking, the Tet Offensive was a disastrous tactical defeat for the North Vietnamese. American fire superiority easily routed Giap's forces. But Giap wasn't just fighting a tactical war. He was fighting for a strategic effect. The sheer psychological shock of such a massive offensive being broadcast right into American living rooms completely shattered the illusion that the war was almost won. It became a massive strategic victory for the North that literally altered U.S. politics forever and ended President Johnson's re-election campaign.
Even though coalition forces and ARVN Rangers fought fiercely and successfully defended Saigon, the brutal lesson of Vietnam is that winning the battle simply does not equal winning the war. Tactical success can't compensate for a strategy that fails to actually secure a lasting peace or build a sustainable host nation.
This ties into a really fascinating, impartial analysis by strategic expert Anthony Cordesman regarding America's recent modern conflicts like Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. He points out a recurring historical pattern. The U.S. repeatedly escalates to war without a clear, achievable endgame. There's a failure to perform strategic triage, which means adequately assessing the true costs and risks of getting involved. Plus, planners consistently underestimate deep ethnic and political divides within the host country, and they try to build up local military forces before actually establishing the rule of law and stable governance.
And the data totally backs this up. Just look at the crazy boom and bust cycle of funding for Afghan security forces over the years. You literally cannot build a sustainable state when your strategy and your funding are fluctuating this wildly from year to year. This kind of unpredictable financial profile actively undermines any realistic long-term stabilization. And amazingly, if you look at the funding for Iraq reconstruction, it perfectly mirrors that exact same chaotic boom and bust pattern. It highlights a repeated historical failure of civil-military coordination. The U.S. has proven it is incredible at using its military might to topple regimes, but the data shows it struggles immensely with the strategic triage and consistent planning required to actually rebuild a stable society afterward.
So, that brings us to the core thesis of this entire explainer, the paradox of American military might. Overwhelming military force is incredibly effective at destroying an enemy on the battlefield, but you absolutely cannot cure a host nation's underlying political, social, and economic diseases simply by treating the violent symptoms with firepower. Grand strategy requires way more than just military dominance.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you with this one provocative thought to chew on. From the muddy fields of Cold Harbor to the deserts of Iran and the streets of Saigon to the mountains of Afghanistan, can a military ever truly win if its civilian leadership hasn't actually defined what a lasting victory looks like? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this helped you see the massive scale of these historical events in a brand new light.